Marcus Thompson had been living on the streets of London for 3 years now. At 24, he had already built a reputation in the rough neighborhoods of East London as someone you didn't want to mess with. His knuckles were scarred from countless fights, and his cold gray eyes had seen more violence than most people twice his age. He had dropped out of school at 16 after his father left and his mother started drinking heavily. The streets became his classroom and survival became his only subject. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus was feeling especially angry. He had spent the night sleeping under a bridge because the homeless shelter was full, and someone had stolen his only decent pair of shoes while he slept. His stomach was empty, his clothes were dirty, and his patience was wearing thin. He walked through the busy streets of central London, watching well-dressed people hurry past him without making eye contact. To them, he was invisible, just another piece of street trash to step around. As Marcus made his way toward Buckingham Palace, he wasn't planning anything specific. He often walked through the tourist areas because sometimes he could pickpocket unsuspecting visitors or find dropped money. The palace area was always crowded with tourists taking pictures and buying souvenirs. It seemed like easy territory for someone with his skills. The morning sun was bright and the streets were bustling with activity. Tour buses dropped off groups of excited visitors while street performers entertained crowds for spare change. Marcus watched it all with bitter resentment. These people had money to waste on vacations while he couldn't even afford a proper meal. The inequality of it all made his blood boil. As he approached the palace gates, Marcus noticed the royal guard standing at attention in their traditional red uniforms and tall black hats. Tourists were taking selfies near them, trying to get the guards to react or smile. Marcus had always heard that these guards were trained not to move or respond to anything, no matter what happened around them. To him, they represented everything he hated about the system: privileged people in fancy uniforms who had never struggled a day in their lives. One guard in particular caught his attention. The man looked to be in his early 30s, tall and muscular, standing perfectly still despite the chaos of tourists around him. His name tag read Sergeant Williams. Something about the guard's composed demeanor irritated Marcus even more. Here was someone who probably came from a good family, had proper training, steady pay, and respect from society, everything Marcus had never had. The anger that had been building up inside Marcus all morning reached a breaking point. He had been pushed around by life for too long, ignored by society, and treated like garbage. Today he decided someone was going to acknowledge his existence. Someone was going to pay attention to him, even if it meant causing trouble. Marcus started walking directly toward Sergeant Williams, his fists clenched at his sides. The tourists around him were too busy taking pictures to notice the dangerous look in his eyes. He had made up his mind. Today was the day he would make someone notice him. Consequences be damned. Sergeant James Williams had been serving as a royal guard for 8 years. Unlike what Marcus assumed, James hadn't come from privilege. He grew up in a working-class family in Manchester, where his father worked double shifts at a factory and his mother cleaned offices at night to make ends meet. He joined the military at 18 because it was his only chance at a stable career and education. Through years of discipline, training, and dedication, he had earned his position as a royal guard. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace was both an honor and a test of mental strength. James had been trained to remain motionless for hours, regardless of weather conditions, tourist antics, or distractions. He had endured everything from people trying to make him laugh to others attempting to provoke him into breaking protocol. His training had taught him to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. As James stood at his post that morning, his peripheral vision caught sight of a young man approaching with unusual intent. Unlike the typical tourist who kept a respectful distance, this individual was walking directly toward him with purpose. James's military training immediately kicked in. He could sense aggression in the man's body language, the clenched fists, the determined stride, the angry expression. While maintaining his stoic exterior, James mentally prepared himself for whatever was about to happen. Marcus stopped just inches from the guard's face. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" He snarled, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. Some people started turning their heads, sensing tension in the air. "Standing there in your fancy uniform, looking down on people like me." James remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead as his training dictated. He had been taught that royal guards must never break character, no matter the provocation. However, His years of military experience had also taught him to assess threats quickly. This wasn't just a tourist trying to get a reaction. This was someone genuinely angry and potentially dangerous. "I'm talking to you," Marcus shouted, his voice getting louder. A small crowd was beginning to form, with people pulling out their phones to record what they thought might be an entertaining interaction. "You deaf or just too good to talk to street trash like me?" The irony wasn't lost on James. Here was someone accusing him of privilege and looking down on others, when James himself had fought tooth and nail for everything he had achieved. But he couldn't break protocol to explain his background or defend himself. He had to trust in his training and remain professional. Marcus's frustration grew as the guard continued to ignore him. This was exactly what he expected. Another person treating him like he didn't exist. The rage that had been building up inside him for years was reaching a dangerous level. He had come too far to back down now, especially with all these people watching. "Fine," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "If you won't acknowledge me with words, maybe this will get your attention." Without warning, Marcus drew back his right fist and threw a powerful punch directly at Sergeant Williams' jaw. The sound of knuckles connecting with bone echoed through the courtyard, causing several tourists to gasp and scream. Some people stumbled backward in shock, while others instinctively raised their phones higher to capture what was happening. What Marcus didn't know was that royal guards undergo extensive combat training beyond their ceremonial duties. They are active military personnel, trained to protect not just the royal family but also themselves and the public. Sergeant Williams wasn't just a man in a costume. He was a highly skilled soldier who had served in combat zones and knew how to handle violent situations. The moment Marcus's fist connected with his jaw, something fundamental changed in Sergeant Williams. While he had absorbed the blow without flinching, his military training immediately switched from ceremonial guard mode to active threat response. The attack on a royal guard wasn't just an assault on him personally, it was an assault on the crown itself, and that demanded immediate action. Marcus felt a moment of satisfaction as his punch landed, thinking he had finally gotten a reaction from the stoic guard. But his satisfaction was short-lived. Instead of stumbling backward or calling for help as Marcus expected, Sergeant Williams turned his head slowly to look directly at his attacker. The cold, calculating look in the guard's eyes made Marcus realize he had made a terrible mistake. "Bad choice, mate," Williams said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that only Marcus could hear. Before Marcus could process what was happening, Williams moved with lightning speed. Years of combat training kicked in as he grabbed Marcus by the shirt collar and delivered a devastating uppercut that connected perfectly with Marcus's chin. The punch was delivered with precision and overwhelming force, the result of thousands of hours of hand-to-hand combat training. The impact was immediate and brutal. Marcus felt his feet leave the ground as his head snapped backward. Stars exploded across his vision and he could taste blood flooding his mouth. 3 of his front teeth, along with a molar, were instantly knocked loose by the powerful blow. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, shooting through his jaw and up into his skull like lightning. Marcus crashed to the ground hard, his body hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. Blood poured from his mouth as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. The teeth that had been knocked out lay scattered on the ground around him, a gruesome reminder of his poor decision. His jaw felt like it might be broken, and every attempt to move his mouth sent waves of agony through his entire head. The crowd of tourists who had been recording the incident erupted in shocked gasps and screams. Some people rushed forward to help, while others backed away in fear. Children started crying, and several adults looked like they might be sick from witnessing such sudden violence. The festive atmosphere around the palace had instantly turned dark and frightening. Sergeant Williams immediately resumed his position at attention, as if nothing had happened. His training dictated that he return to his post unless ordered otherwise, even after dealing with a threat. However, his fellow guards had already sprung into action. Within seconds, additional royal guards appeared from seemingly nowhere, surrounding the scene to maintain order and assess the situation. Marcus lay on the ground, barely conscious and choking on his own blood. The metallic taste filled his mouth as he tried to speak, but only garbled sounds came out. He attempted to sit up, but the world spun violently around him and he collapsed back down. The confident street fighter who had approached the guard just minutes earlier was now a broken, bleeding mess on the palace grounds. A royal guard sergeant approached Williams and spoke quietly. Status report, Sergeant. Individual assaulted me with intent to cause harm, Williams replied calmly, never breaking his professional demeanor. I neutralized the threat using minimal necessary force. Subject is down but breathing. The efficiency and professionalism of Williams's response was a stark contrast to Marcus's reckless aggression. While Marcus had acted out of anger and desperation, Williams had responded with trained precision, using exactly the amount of force needed to end the threat without causing unnecessary damage. Within minutes of the incident, the palace grounds were swarming with additional security personnel. The Metropolitan Police arrived in marked vehicles, their sirens cutting through the air as they responded to the emergency call. Paramedics followed close behind, rushing through the crowd with medical equipment to attend to Marcus, who was still lying on the ground in considerable pain. The area around the palace gates was quickly cordoned off with yellow tape as police officers began interviewing witnesses. Dozens of tourists had captured the entire incident on their smartphones, and the footage was already beginning to spread on social media. The hashtags began trending within hours, with people debating whether the guard's response was justified or excessive. Marcus was barely conscious as the paramedics worked on him. His mouth was packed with gauze to control the bleeding, and they carefully collected his knocked-out teeth in case they could be surgically reattached. The lead paramedic, Sarah Chen, had seen many assault victims in her career, but the precision of the damage suggested this wasn't just a random street fight. Looks like a single, very powerful blow to the jaw, she explained to her partner as they prepared Marcus for transport. Clean break on 3 teeth, possible jaw fracture. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. As Marcus was loaded into the ambulance, Detective Inspector Robert Hayes arrived on the scene. A 20-year veteran of the Met Police, Hayes had investigated countless assault cases, but incidents involving royal guards were rare and always required careful handling. The political implications alone meant that every detail would be scrutinized by multiple government departments. Hayes approached Sergeant Williams, who remained at his post despite the chaos around him. Sergeant Williams, I'm Detective Inspector Hayes. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened here. Williams maintained his military bearing as he recounted the events. His report was precise and factual, delivered without emotion or embellishment. He explained how Marcus had approached him aggressively, made verbal threats, and then physically attacked him. His response, he stated, was in accordance with his training to protect himself and maintain the security of the palace grounds. The individual struck me with significant force, Williams explained. Given his aggressive behavior and the security-sensitive nature of this location, I responded with appropriate defensive measures to neutralize the threat. Detective Hayes nodded as he took notes. The legal framework around royal guards was complex, but they did have the authority to use reasonable force to protect themselves and carry out their duties. The challenge would be determining whether Williams's response was proportionate to the threat Marcus posed. Meanwhile, several witnesses were eager to share their accounts of what they had seen. Most tourists supported the guard's actions, describing Marcus as the clear aggressor who had initiated the violence. However, a few expressed concern about the severity of the guard's response, questioning whether such force was necessary against an unarmed man. Jennifer Martinez, a tourist from Spain, had captured the entire incident on video. The young man was definitely aggressive and threw the first punch, she told Detective Hayes. But the guard's response was so fast and powerful. It was like watching a professional fighter, not just a ceremonial guard. The incident raised important questions about the dual role of royal guards. To the public, they appeared to be ceremonial figures, standing motionless in their traditional uniforms. But they were also active military personnel, trained for combat and authorized to use force when necessary. This disconnect between public perception and reality was at the heart of the controversy that was already beginning to brew. As news of the incident spread, it sparked debates about social inequality, police brutality, and the role of traditional institutions in modern society. Marcus's background as a homeless man led some to view him as a victim of societal neglect, while others saw him as someone who brought violence upon himself through his own poor choices. At St. Mary's Hospital, Marcus slowly regained full consciousness in the emergency room. The pain medication helped dull the agony in his jaw, but the reality of his situation was becoming clear. His mouth was wired shut to stabilize a fractured jaw, and the oral surgeon had explained that 2 of his teeth were completely lost while 1 might be saved with extensive dental work he couldn't afford. Dr. Amanda Foster, the attending physician, reviewed Marcus's chart with a mixture of professional concern and personal curiosity. She had treated many assault victims, but this case was unusual. The precision of the injury suggested military or police training, yet the victim was clearly the aggressor according to witness statements. "Mr. Thompson, you're very lucky," Dr. Foster explained, though Marcus could only grunt in response due to his wired jaw. "The blow could have caused much more serious damage. You have a fractured jaw and significant dental trauma, but no brain injury or permanent disability." As Marcus lay in his hospital bed, he had plenty of time to think about the chain of events that led him there. The anger that had driven him to attack the guard now seemed foolish and self-destructive. He had always prided himself on being tough, but he had been completely outmatched by someone he had underestimated. Detective Inspector Hayes visited Marcus once he was stable enough to communicate. Through written notes, since Marcus couldn't speak properly, Hayes gathered Marcus's version of events. His story didn't differ significantly from the witness accounts, though he tried to downplay his aggression and emphasize his desperation and hunger. "I wasn't thinking straight," Marcus wrote on the notepad. "I've been on the streets for 3 years. I just wanted someone to see me as a human being." Hayes had seen this pattern before. Young men from difficult backgrounds often lashed out at symbols of authority when their frustration reached a breaking point. While he sympathized with Marcus's circumstances, the law was clear about who was responsible for the violence. Meanwhile, the incident had become a media sensation. News outlets were running stories about the Royal Guard knockout, with opinion pieces debating everything from homelessness policy to the militarization of ceremonial roles. Social media was divided, with some praising Sergeant Williams for his professionalism and others calling for an investigation into excessive force. Sergeant Williams found himself at the center of a controversy he never wanted. Military police had interviewed him extensively, and while they concluded his actions were justified, the public scrutiny was intense. He received both hate mail from those who saw him as a bully and fan mail from those who viewed him as a hero. Neither reaction sat well with him. The Royal Guard's commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Morrison, held a press conference to address the incident. She emphasized that Royal Guards are active military personnel with extensive training, not just ceremonial figures. "Sergeant Williams acted in accordance with his training in the law," she stated firmly. He was assaulted while performing his duties and responded appropriately to neutralize the threat. However, the incident had sparked a broader conversation about the visibility of homelessness in London and the desperation that drives people to extreme actions. Marcus had become an unlikely symbol of social inequality, despite being the clear aggressor in the altercation. Social worker Linda Patel, who had worked with homeless populations for over a decade, used the incident to highlight the mental health crisis among rough sleepers. "This young man was crying out for help in the most destructive way possible," she explained to a local news station. "When people feel invisible and hopeless, they sometimes do desperate things to feel acknowledged." The incident also raised questions about security protocols around royal properties. While Royal Guards had always been authorized to use force, the public nature of this confrontation highlighted the potential for similar incidents in the future. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus was released from the hospital with his jaw still partially wired and a court date scheduled for assault charges. The Crown Prosecution Service had decided to proceed with criminal charges, despite some public pressure to show leniency given Marcus's circumstances. The assault of a royal guard was taken seriously by the legal system, regardless of the underlying social issues involved. Marcus found himself in an even worse position than before the incident. His medical bills were mounting, he had no way to pay for the dental work he needed, and his notoriety made it even harder to find employment or housing. Several homeless shelters had turned him away, worried about the negative publicity his presence might bring. However, the incident had also brought him some unexpected attention. Sarah Wilson, a documentary filmmaker who focused on social justice issues, reached out to Marcus through the hospital. She was interested in telling his story as part of a larger piece about homelessness and social inequality in London. "Your story represents something bigger than just one moment of poor judgment," Sarah explained during their first meeting. "It shows how desperation can drive people to make choices that ultimately hurt themselves more than anyone else." Marcus was initially reluctant to participate. The shame of what he had done was overwhelming, and he didn't want to be seen as making excuses for his violence. But Sarah convinced him that sharing his story might help other people in similar situations and potentially change how society addresses homelessness. Meanwhile, Sergeant Williams was dealing with his own aftermath from the incident. While he had been cleared of any wrongdoing, the intense media scrutiny had taken a toll on him and his family. His wife, Rebecca, had received threatening messages from people who viewed her husband as a symbol of institutional violence against the poor. Williams requested a meeting with his commanding officer to discuss the situation. "Colonel Morrison, I joined the military to serve my country, not to become a social media controversy," he said. "I'm concerned about how this is affecting my family." Colonel Morrison understood his concern. "Sergeant, you handled a difficult situation exactly as you were trained to do. The fact that people are using this incident to debate larger social issues isn't your responsibility. You protected yourself and upheld your duty." Despite the official support, Williams couldn't shake the feeling that there might have been a better way to handle the situation. He had been trained to use minimal necessary force, but seeing the extent of Marcus's injuries made him question whether he could have de-escalated differently. The legal proceedings moved forward quickly. Marcus's court-appointed lawyer, David Chen, advised him to plead guilty to assault and hope for a suspended sentence given his circumstances. The evidence was overwhelming, with multiple witnesses and video footage clearly showing Marcus as the aggressor. During the sentencing hearing, several factors came into play. Marcus's history of homelessness and mental health struggles were presented as mitigating circumstances, while the seriousness of assaulting a royal guard was emphasized by the prosecution. Character witnesses spoke about Marcus's difficult childhood and the circumstances that led to his life on the streets. The judge, Honorable Patricia Blackwood, had extensive experience with cases involving both violent crime and social inequality. She recognized the complexity of the situation and the broader issues it represented. "Mr. Thompson, while I understand the desperate circumstances that led to your actions, I cannot overlook the fact that you initiated violence against someone who was simply doing his job," Judge Blackwood stated during sentencing. "However, I also recognize that you are as much a victim of societal failures as you are a perpetrator of violence." The sentence reflected this balance. Marcus received 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, along with 200 hours of community service and mandatory counseling. He was also ordered to write a formal apology to Sergeant Williams, though whether it would be delivered was left to Williams's discretion. 6 months after the incident, both Marcus and Sergeant Williams had found their lives changed in unexpected ways. Marcus's participation in Sarah Wilson's documentary had led to connections with several social service organizations. Through the mandatory counseling ordered by the court, he had begun addressing the anger and trauma that had driven him to violence. The community service requirement had placed Marcus at a youth center in East London, where he worked with teenagers from troubled backgrounds. His experience on the streets, combined with the harsh lesson he had learned about the consequences of violence, made him an effective mentor for young people facing similar challenges. "I tell these kids that anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to get sick," Marcus explained to one of the youth workers. "I thought hurting someone else would make me feel better, but it only made everything worse." His dental work had been partially covered by a charity fund established after the documentary aired. While he would never fully recover from the damage to his jaw and teeth, he had regained the ability to speak clearly and eat normally. More importantly, he had found a sense of purpose in helping others avoid the mistakes he had made. Sergeant Williams had also experienced personal growth from the incident. The controversy had forced him to think deeply about his role as both a soldier and a symbol. He had requested additional training in de-escalation techniques and had become an advocate within the military for better preparation when dealing with mentally distressed individuals. Williams's wife, Rebecca, had initially urged him to request a transfer away from ceremonial duties, but he had decided to stay. "If I transfer now, it looks like I'm running away from what happened," he explained to her. "I need to prove to myself that I can handle these situations better in the future." The Royal Guard had implemented new protocols partly as a result of the incident. While guards were still authorized to use force when necessary, they now received enhanced training in recognizing signs of mental distress and techniques for verbal de-escalation before situations became physical. The most unexpected development came 8 months after the incident. Marcus, through his work at the youth center, had written a letter to Sergeant Williams. Unlike the formal apology required by the court, this was a personal message explaining his journey since that day and thanking Williams for inadvertently setting him on a path toward getting help. Williams was surprised to receive the letter and even more surprised by its contents. Marcus wrote about how the consequences of his actions had forced him to confront his problems and seek help. While he didn't minimize the harm he had caused, he explained how the incident had become a turning point in his life. After much consideration, Williams decided to respond. His letter was brief but sincere, wishing Marcus well in his recovery and expressing hope that they could both learn from what had happened. This exchange led to an unprecedented meeting arranged through the documentary filmmaker. The meeting took place at a neutral location, with counselors present to ensure it remained constructive. Both men were nervous, unsure of what to expect from face-to-face contact. Marcus's appearance had changed dramatically. He was clean, well-dressed, and his speech was clear despite the permanent changes to his dental structure. "I want you to know that I don't blame you for what happened to me," Marcus said during their conversation. "You were doing your job, and I was the one who brought violence into the situation. Everything that happened after was a consequence of my choice to attack you." Williams was moved by Marcus's honesty and accountability. "I've thought about that day many times," he replied. "I wonder if there was something I could have done differently to prevent it from escalating." Their meeting wasn't about forgiveness or friendship, but about understanding. Both men had been changed by a moment of violence that could have been avoided. Marcus had learned that his anger only hurt himself and others, while Williams had gained a deeper appreciation for the complex social issues that drive people to desperate actions. The documentary featuring both of their stories won several awards and sparked important conversations about homelessness, mental health, and the use of force by authority figures. More importantly for both men, it marked the end of one chapter in their lives and the beginning of another, where they could move forward with greater wisdom and purpose.